Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I'd like to have an argument, please.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten and I'm joined by Chad Gross. Greetings, Chad. How you doing?
I'm very well. I got to tell you, man, it is hot and humid here in Hagerstown. It's hot, humid Hagerstown. A little alliteration for you today. Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, cool. Today we're going to be talking about 5 arguments that every Christian should know. Now, we will get to that in a minute, but I just want to let you know what we're going to be talking about. Follow the link in the show notes to our podcast feedback survey to be entered to win an apologetics book of your choice. It'll take 90 seconds for your feedback, and it'll help make the podcast better for you. The idea for today's podcast came from some feedback from a listener who had basically said, it would be cool to do an episode on, something like the 5 arguments every Christian should know. And so Chad and I got talking about, what would those be? Would it be just grab like On Guard off by William Lane Craig off the shelf and just, here they are. In a sense, you could do that. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, okay, here's what we'll do. I'll come up with what I think 5 arguments are that every Christian should know. And Chad will come up with his, and we'll compare notes live. We'll do that on today's podcast, and you can let us know by giving us feedback what arguments you think are most helpful for Christians. And, the goal in those, in my mind, are being able to defend the faith competently and confidently without being necessarily an expert on any of these arguments. That's my thoughts. What are your thoughts, Chad?
I think that's exactly right. That's our heart here as to what are some arguments that you could use in conversation to show people the reasonableness of Christianity. I also want to say from the onset that the arguments that Brian is going to share and the arguments that I'm going to share may not necessarily be the arguments that are the most convincing or that you find the most plausible. And I think that, you should develop your own case for the Christian faith based upon your study of apologetics and philosophy and good arguments. And it should be, the arguments you use should be the ones that you yourself find the most compelling, because that's important. You don't want to present a case like Brian was talking about, how sure you could pick up On Guard and you could memorize those arguments and you could present them. But do you find those arguments more plausible than not? Are you convinced of them? Because if not, you should use other arguments that you have found convincing. And so I think that's just an important note to say.
Some arguments are more convincing to me. For instance, the ontological argument by Alvin Plantinga might be more convincing to me, but I can't wield it. None of us can. It's like the One Ring. Mm-hmm. It'll destroy you.
I was at a conference once. I think I've told you this before, and I was moderating a debate, and one of the debaters came over to me and he said, like the ontological argument, he's like, I think it's sound. He's like, I think it works. But at the same time, sometimes I feel like I'm being duped.
Yes. Well, I don't know about you, Chad, but I know that there are really strong and better phrased arguments, better outlined arguments in a philosophical sense, like with lots of numbered premises and very specific terminology to avoid all the little kind of intricate pitfalls and nuances. That's not my goal here. Your list might be different,
Same.
But my goal is like, it seems to me the spirit of the questioner was like, hey, how do I get through the day as a Christian in the world with things that are going to help me not only share my faith and defend it, but to feel more confident in it. I'm going for the ones that are easier to sort of handle.
Right. Yeah. This kind of harkens back to the podcast we did where we took various apologetics, arguments that are popular in apologetics, and we broke them down and talked about, okay, how would this sound in a conversation? It kind of echoes what you're saying there, echoes that. I agree with you. We're not experts. We're not PhDs. But at the same time, I can say that I've either presented these arguments or I have actually used them in conversation with unbelievers, and I have found them to be effective. And so that's worth something.
What I'll do is I'll read you the 5 I've come up with that I think every Christian should be familiar with. And then you read me yours, and we'll decide how we should approach them depending on how close or different they are. Ready? Here we go. So here's my 5 arguments that every Christian should know. A cosmological argument. You should know a cosmological argument. You should know a moral argument. You should know a design argument, and you should know an argument for the resurrection and an argument for the reliability of the New Testament. I hope you don't think I'm cheating there, but it's kind of like back to the intro there where I'm saying pick one that you like. But I think those you should pick from those categories because I think it's a good sort of a all-purpose approach. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Now I'll elaborate on which ones I think might be helpful. But you want to go?
Yes. So interestingly, I do want to say before I get into my 5, I actually had a much harder time with this than I thought I would. When you read the listener feedback when we were talking, kind of during a planning time we were having, I remember thinking, oh, that'll be easy. And then I started actually trying to write it out. And certain arguments kept getting like included, kicked out, so I could make room for other ones. And I thought maybe I'll just share 6. And then I thought, no, I've got to, stick with 5. And so I started thinking about, conversations I've actually had, issues that I've actually had to address. And I thought, okay, these are the 4 that I would really think would be helpful to know kind of inside and out, if you will, and be able to present them. So here are my 5. My first one might be different. I think you have to start with why religious pluralism is false. And the reason I picked that is because so much of the sentiment here in the area I live in, and I don't know how much this is true of the United States, is just all religions are the same. And that you really can't even parse out which, certain ones are true and certain ones are false, or one is more true than the other. They're not even thought about in that way. Yeah. And so I think for me, it's important to point out, this idea that all religions can be true or all religions are equally valid. All religions are basically trying to teach the same thing. That has to be demonstrated to be false. And I think that's kind of laying the ground there. So that's my first one is that's good. Why religious pluralism is false. Secondly is the Kalam cosmological argument. I was more specific. And I would be happy to talk about why I didn't pick the one that I know you like most. And we'll get into that more as we unpack them. My third one was the fine-tuning argument. Fourth one was a moral argument. I have kind of 2 different versions, and it just depends on the length of conversation that you're having, and it depends on how familiar the person is with the arguments as to which one you would use. And then finally, mine is a resurrection argument. And I struggled so much, I will let you know where I really had trouble was, do I want to say reliability of the New Testament so you can make a resurrection argument? And I thought, but that's technically 2 different arguments, And so I included the resurrection but if I had another argument to add on, I would want to argue for the reliability of the New Testament so that I could go further with the resurrection, but also so I could demonstrate the deity of Christ.
Good. I like these. I like those. I really like the one you chose at the beginning as well. Didn't even enter my mind.
Well, and again, it's just from this. It might not be in the area where you're at, but in the area I'm in, and even in my profession, that's just I've run into that so much of just like, well, it's not. You can't really say Christianity's better than Buddhism, and it's like, well, I'm not saying it's better. They don't even think of it in categories of what's true and false.
Yeah. Well, I just use these 5 arguments, and for everything else, I have chick tracks. So
exactly, you got to have your chick tracks, man. I mean, if you can't win them with arguments and your winsome approach, terrify them.
Man, some of those are great. Some of them are really scary. Okay, so back to the arguments. So I don't know what cosmological argument you thought I would choose. You probably thought I would choose the Leibnizian one, but I actually thought the Kalam argument.
Oh, wow. I actually thought you'd go with the contingency, the Leibnizian.
I like that one. Wow. And it's one of those ones that I would go to. I think it's really persuasive, as a sort of who am I? Why am I here? Why is there anything at all? Kind of leading question.
And especially the more you unpack it.
Yeah. And again, these are here's the context. I'm thinking about, again, my audience for this podcast is those who are asking me for advice on what would be useful for them to learn. And I'm also thinking from the perspective of conversations I'm having with people or trying to win them to Christ and maybe objections they're having. So I would definitely use the Leibnizian one, which goes like there is a sufficient reason for the universe existing, whether it's been here forever or came into existence. But I think that the Kalam, and we'll spell it out just for the sake of the listener, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Obviously, we're just using that as a point of bringing the listener to think about, well, what is the nature of that cause? What could cause everything to come into existence? I think that's a good lead into conversations,
Yeah. I actually recently, I shared this with you off podcast, if you will, but I recently had a conversation with one of my dearest friends. He's been, we've been friends for over 20 years. And he, for the past several years, has been kind of seeking God and trying to make up his mind about what he actually believes. And he's still on the fence. He's kind of still kicking the tires and trying to figure things out. But one of the things he said in the conversation was he addressed this argument, and he said, there are times where I'm thinking and I keep going back to that idea that the universe exploded into existence at some point in the finite past. And for me, that makes me think, this is what he said, that makes me think that this just might be real.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how, the cause of the explosion, or the Big Bang, as it's been it was pejoratively called originally, could not have been from within the natural order because nature itself didn't exist prior to the Big Bang. And so we can conclude that the cause is outside of nature, which is the very definition of supernatural. And of course, from this, we can conclude also that this cause, whatever it is, has to be spaceless because there was no space, timeless because there was no time, and material because there was no matter, supernatural, as we've already, talked about, and inconceivably powerful because it was able to bring the whole universe into existence from that initial singularity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would guess we would point readers to reasonablefaith.org and books by William Lane Craig, but probably the best starter book for that would be On Guard. Lots of resources online, and also all his great little YouTube videos that explain those arguments.
Yes.
I chose a moral argument, and if I had to suggest one to keep in the back pocket, and I know it's some people who are hardcore into apologetics be like, what? That's so weak. But every law has a lawgiver. There's a moral law. Therefore, there's a moral lawgiver. And I am going for simplicity and ease of use rather than some bigger one or more powerful one, because I think that in a conversation, it's easier to use illustrations and use examples and get deeper as needed rather than starting deep and philosophical. So I'd say every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, and give reasons, supporting reasons. Therefore, there's a moral lawgiver. Basically, I use that argument to start a conversation about what is the source of our moral knowledge, which we can't deny. And so that's the perspective I'm coming from. And again, I might use that in conversation, but I'm so glad that I also know heavier arguments in the back of my mind that I'm drawing from as I'm talking about it. So this is what I would use in a conversation, but I'm thinking about all the other things I've read about moral arguments, on the more philosophical side of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. That is a great argument to start with. I can tell you that's my wife's favorite version of the moral argument, and she's used it in conversation several times and had a lot of success with it. I would also say that Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is probably the best place to see a defense of that formulation of the moral argument. I have two versions. One shoots for simplicity as well, like as you're talking about. And then another one is a little bit more advanced. And I didn't want to not include this because of what you're saying. You said at the top of the podcast, yeah, we want to stick with simplicity, but at the same time, if somebody wants to dig deeper, I want them to have some tools as well, which is what we're trying to provide. The first form I like is something along the lines of this. If moral facts exist, God is the best explanation. Moral facts exist, therefore God is the best explanation. And the reason I like that argument is just because it focuses on the question of what is the best explanation of moral facts, meaning that there are things that are truly right, there are things that are truly wrong. What is the best explanation of that? Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that?
No, I like that. Whenever we talk about the best explanation, I find that it's useful, assuming an honest, so to speak, dialogue partner who's having much like your friend you're talking about. You're able to talk through this and say, well, what do you think's the best explanation for this?
Yeah, like J. Warner Wallace would say, you have to pick your jury.
Yeah.
Right. You have to pick a wise jury, right? Yeah, and then the second form is from, or the second type of moral argument is an abductive, kind of cumulative argument from our friend, David Baggett, who we both love. And it goes something like this. It takes four features of kind of the moral realm, and it says moral facts, moral knowledge, moral transformation, and moral rationality require a robust explanation. The best explanation of these phenomenon is God. Therefore, God probably exists. And so Baggett has pointed out, and you see this in videos and podcasts that he's done as well, that this argument takes a lot more to unpack. And this argument does require conversations and back and forth. But if you want to see this argument hashed out more in kind of a layman's terms, their book, The Morals of the Story, Good News About a Good God, that Dr. Baggett co-wrote with his wife, Marybeth, is a great place to start. And then for the other version I started with, there's one similar to that in William Lane Craig's On Guard.
Mm-hmm. All right. So my third argument that I think that Christians should be familiar with is a design argument. And again, I'm going for simplicity. I'm thinking about, can I share this with my kids? And in this case, the answer is yes. So that means an adult can use it too. Every design has a designer. The universe is designed. Therefore, the universe has a designer. So now, personally, I like the simplicity of this because if I say fine tuning, although that's a powerful argument, and you can point back to various podcasts where we talk about that, and there's great videos about the fine tuning argument, which is a design argument. I just like the simplicity of it because you can choose just how simple or deep you want to go with the examples. If you're familiar with fine-tuning arguments or DNA or information in the cell, that sort of a thing, biological systems, or, the laws of the universe, you can kind of pick what you want to talk about as far as showing examples of design and how if every design needs a designer, it's a good argument. And it's very intuitive. I like just to keep it simple and go deep as needed. So that's my choice for the design argument.
Yeah, I like what you said there in regard to every design has a designer, the universe has design, therefore the universe is designed. Did I repeat that correctly?
Therefore the universe has a designer.
Designer, right. So I like the fact that, as you said, you can pick, there are numerous arguments that you can pick from to argue for that second premise. And some arguments might be more comfortable for somebody than somebody else. And so I think that's helpful. I like that version too. It's a great beginner version as well. So it makes it very applicable to conversation, like you said. Well, one of the things I picked in my arguments is obviously you can see, especially after kind of arguing against why religious pluralism is false, the rest of my case is cumulative. In other words, the arguments build upon one another. So the kalam tells us something about the cause, the fine-tuning tells us something about the cause, and then the moral argument tells us something about the cause. So I really feel like, in a sense, that the kalam and the fine-tuning argument really go together well. And why I mean that is because we know that from the very beginning, these initial constants that enable the universe to sustain life, for example, the force of gravity, were present. So meaning that from the first moment the universe came into existence, it was programmed to form the universe we inhabit. So this isn't some random chaotic event, but a precise prefigured moment of creation. And to me, that just goes really nicely into the fine tuning. And of course, the fine tuning is really easy to illustrate in the sense of, think about, it's like a radio. If you want a certain station to come in, you have to tamper with the dial and tune it until the needle is right where you want it to be. Well, in the same way, there's multiple different dials in the universe of all these constants of physics, and they have, millions, in some cases trillions of possible settings, and they happen to be precisely set in order for life to be able to come into existence. And so to me, that is really powerful, and one complements the other. And one way to sum this up, which Brian, you could use your syllogism, actually, like your form of the argument. This could be used to support the second premise, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So the fine-tuning argument, as presented by, probably most famously by William Lane Craig, of course, Robin Collins defends it as well, but in Luke Barnes. But it's the fine-tuning of the universe is either due to physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. Therefore, it is due to design. And if you want to hear that unpacked a bit more, I would recommend starting with On Guard by William Lane Craig.
Mm-hmm. So I say that every Christian should know, number 4, an argument for the resurrection. There are many different ways you could formulate an argument for the resurrection, and my approach is something like this. I'm thinking about who am I with? What background information are they familiar with? What sort of understanding do they have of the scriptures, and how historically reliable do they think it is? How much time do I have with them? What is the other context of my conversation with them? How close are they to believing this? Are they super skeptical and going to shoot down every single point, and I have to be very careful how I make it? Or are they just honestly open to looking at general facts and thinking about what seems plausible? And I'm judging my approach based upon not, how it's going to score in a philosophical journal reviewed by peers, but I'm thinking about the leading of the Holy Spirit. Am I going to be able to talk to this person again? And so my approach is going to be completely person dependent and sensitive to the Holy Spirit, if that's at all possible, and I'm praying for that. So I think that what's helpful in making an argument for the resurrection, there are many ways to do it. You do have to be familiar with facts surrounding the historical events, things like the empty tomb, Jesus' appearances to the disciples, to the women witnesses, the different people who were converted and believed it after the fact, such as Jesus' half-brother James, the persecutor Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul. So you can start to build a picture for your conversation partner about what was going on, and they can be a witness to those events. Now, if they have issues with whether or not those things really happened, maybe you can go down those roads as needed. But as long as they're open to talking about a picture of what happened after Jesus was crucified and put in that tomb, and what happened after the fact, and what accounts for that, then you can start to argue. You think the best explanation for everything that we know about that situation is that Jesus rose from the dead because God raised him from the dead. And look at the context for everything he said and did prior to that, all the prophecies leading up to that, and how Christianity performed, so to speak, after the fact in such a hostile environment. That's sort of the approach I would suggest people take. And there's lots of different books you could glean a lot from, which cover this from so many different angles. But I would just suggest to use what's going to be useful in the conversation and just talk about it. Pray that the Holy Spirit would move on the heart of the person you're talking to illuminate the events surrounding Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. What persuades you about those events, and argue from that perspective. So that's my take on the resurrection argument.
A lot of good thoughts there, helpful. I like to present a case for the resurrection that just is a set of facts that are highly evidenced. And I've used this in conversation numerous times, and I've found it super helpful. And again, recently, even in the conversation I had, one of the things that the gentleman asked me, my good friend, he said, well, what really hangs me up is like, how do I know the disciples weren't lying? And I said, let's first of all look at these facts that are highly evidenced, and then we'll talk about how does that inform us about whether or not the disciples lied. And so I like to use an acronym that I got from Abdu Murray. It's not original to me, but it's CASE. The C stands for the crucifixion of Jesus, and the A stands for the appearances. The S stands for skeptics. So, for example, like the Apostle Paul, who was obviously a persecutor of the church and then turned and became a Christian. Also, Jesus' half-brother, who we know thought he was crazy, and then all of a sudden he's the leader and a leader in the early church. And then, of course, E, as you mentioned, the empty tomb. And so I said, well, let's look at these facts, and we talked about some of the evidence for each fact, where you can look into that. And then I said, well, does it make sense that we know that they they claimed and that their actions demonstrated that they really believed it. And then we were able to talk about what were they gaining by making this up. And of course, I used the J. Warner Wallace kind of, was it sex? Was it money? Was it power? Because he found that very plausible. They it makes sense. They would have done it for one of those. And he agreed that it really wasn't a great explanation to say that they gained any of those. And so just laying out those facts and saying, OK, let's look at your explanation. And it was a very cordial, thoughtful conversation. And it was able to show him that, yeah, I guess it's not real plausible that they were lying. Now, I want to say that I think that argument is a great elevator pitch. I think it's a great place to start to make a case for the resurrection and to talk about the best explanation for those highly evidenced facts. But I would never want to stop there. And I think that's where this debate between, should we use minimal facts? Should we use maximal facts? How should we approach it? I think for me, that's where I part ways with kind of both camps, is I don't think it has to be an either or. I think one can easily lead into the other. And I can even say, well, hey, we've got this set of facts and a large group of skeptics would grant these. And of course, I don't agree with their conclusions, but hey, let's just start with these and see where we can get. Now, let me tell you why I think the New Testament is reliable. But at least you've hooked them, in a sense, with this minimal factsy, minimalism, whatever you want to call it, type of argument. That just depends on what evidence you use to support your facts. Just to offer some resources that I have found helpful with this are Cold Case Christianity. I like J. Warner Wallace's thoughts, which I alluded to. Of course, that's by J. Warner Wallace. And then The Case for the Resurrection by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona is a great place to start to lay that foundation for a good resurrection argument as well.
So those are good resources to start with, and we'll link to others that are also helpful in building your own case for the resurrection and looking what other people have done in that regard. My fifth argument is making or having your own argument for the reliability of the New Testament. So here's one that I kind of think is a scaled down version, a 4-point version, and you can find that by J. Warner Wallace. But he makes 4 points. They were written early. They're corroborated, they haven't changed over time, and they're not biased. The idea is to have some reasons to talk about when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament. Why should we believe anything that we read in the Gospels? I'll also link to a great article by Frank Turek, or on Frank Turek's website, and it's called 12 Reasons to Trust the New Testament. And it's a little bit more fuller argument, and so he says there's multiple independent sources contributed to it. We have thousands of New Testament manuscripts. The manuscripts were written early. Documents are a collection of eyewitness accounts. Non-Christian sources confirm the most important details. We can reconstruct it using just quotes of early church fathers. Historical and archaeological evidence corroborate it. Fulfills ancient prophecies in amazing ways. Contains embarrassing details. And includes the different sayings of Jesus. The chain of custody confirms the contents of the original. It contains undesigned coincidences that verify its authenticity. And the New Testament verifies the Old Testament. So that's harder to remember, good to understand.
Sure. But
maybe in the conversational aspect, those 4 points about being written early, being corroborated, not changing over time, and being not biased. In other words, back to what you were saying, they didn't have anything to gain by telling this story that was going to put them in hot water, so to speak. So yeah, well, I'll link to the few resources on that. Also, Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams is great. New Testament reliability. The New Testament documents, Are They Reliable by F.F. Bruce. That's a classic, must read. I'd point you there.
Yeah, and I, again, that was one of the ones that kept making my list, and I kept removing because I was trying to stick to 5. But if I could add another one, that's definitely the next step in kind of my cumulative thinking would be like, okay, now we're going to make a even broader picture for more and bring in more data after showing, okay, now that we've given good grounds to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, now we're going to kind of broaden our scope to find out more of who he is by arguing for the reliability of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, too, I have to fit in my religious pluralism argument, right, against religious pluralism.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this would be the first, and again, this is person relative. I might be talking to somebody who obviously thinks that they all can't be true or equally valid or something. But again, in my experience and talking to people, that's the general attitude of, wow, how can you really say one is valid and another's not? Isn't it just based on beliefs? Kind of like they almost think it seems like it would be the same as saying, vanilla is objectively better than chocolate, is kind of the sense I get when I talk to people sometimes. And so the way that I kind of help people think about this and begin to move from the picture of, okay, which one is preferred, to actually move to the starting to ask the question, which one, if any, is true, is first of all, I point out that they're different. They differ on almost every significant fact. For example, they differ on various religions differ on the nature of God, the nature of man, sin, salvation, heaven, hell, creation. And I mean, obviously, those are the biggies, right? Those are the big things. And just some key differences here, like Jews and Christians and Muslims believe in different versions of a theistic God. Most Hindus and New Agers, they believe that everything that exists is part of this impersonal pantheistic force they call God. Many Hindus believe that evil is a complete illusion, while Christians and Muslims and Jews believe that evil's real. Christians believe that people are saved by grace, while all other religions, if they believe in salvation at all, teach some kind of salvation by good works, even though their definition of good and what one is saved from varies greatly. And so also, if you think about just some of the major claims or of different religions, if you look at Judaism, Jesus is not the Messiah. Christianity, he is. Muslims, Jesus didn't die on the cross. Christians, yes, he did. Mormons, Jesus is the spirit brother of Lucifer. Christians, no, he's not. And so you begin to see that it can't be that they're all equally valid or they're equally true, because they contradict. It's logically impossible that they all are true or equally valid. And so, of course, then we need to begin the hard work of saying, well, which one makes claims that are true or most correlate with reality? And that, of course, is where the kalam and the fine tuning and the moral argument and the resurrection argument and the reliability of the New Testament are very helpful.
Yes. Right. Well, I'm interested in knowing if this has been helpful for our listeners. So let us know with your feedback. And while you're at it, let us know what arguments you think are the most helpful or would be the most useful for Christians to know. In defending the faith.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
And defending the faith, making a case for it. Don't forget, check the show notes for our podcast feedback survey. We're going to enter you in to win an apologetics book of your choice. Takes 90 seconds. All right, well, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
See you later.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.